Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. Hello, everyone. My name is Saeed Atif Rizwan, and I am Assistant Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies and Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies Program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, USA. Welcome to today's hour, and we really appreciate your time. It's my honor to introduce to you our speaker, Reverend Dr. Aaron Stauffer. He is the Associate Director of Online Learning and the Wendland-Cook Program in Religious and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. His scholarly and organizing work lies at the intersection of the academy, the Christian church, and community organizing. His current book is it just came out in February 2024 with Oxford University Press, and it's titled Listening to the Spirit, the Radical Social Gospel, Sacred Values, and Broad-Based Community Organizing. It's a work of Christian social ethics in the tradition of the radical social gospel, and the book addresses the political limits in community organizing by arguing that organizing networks can build deeper solidarity through sacred values and provide Christians with political theological tools to understand the relational meeting and the listening campaign as religious practices. Dr. Stauffer is a ordained minister and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church of the USA. And he was recently the executive director and then special advisor of Religion for Peace USA, where he helped launch a national anti-Islamophobia program based in the Southeast, along with organizing national senior religious leaders on issues of common concern, such as mass incarceration, immigration, and climate change. So a very accomplished colleague, and it is an honor to have you here, Aaron, and so I will turn over the keys to you.
Thank you, Saeed. Thank you, Dr. Rizwan. And thank you to the Oxford Interfaith Forum for having me here today. It's a joy to be with you all. Thank you, Thea, for your leadership here. This is such a joy to be with you. The talk today that I've titled it "The Ties That Bond Us: Differences of Sacred Value in Interfaith Organizing." It draws from mainly two chapters from my book, Listening to the Spirit, which I've put some relevant links in the chat. I think at the OUP website, it's sold out, and then they're undergoing some technology updates. I do apologize about the price ad on Amazon. So that's partly, if you're interested in it, after the 15th, I should be able to get you a discounted copy because those are valuable. But let me begin with a story. Several years ago, I was organizing a public meeting in a city in the Southeast during Ramadan. Over the years, the community iftar grew from its first-year crowd of 75 people to selling out the 250 tickets over a weekend. City council members, the mayor, and powerful religious leaders were all regular attendees. The iftar's theme sought to make clear the deep connection between Islamic values and their public expression in the life of the Muslim community. We had two goals for the evening. First, that the attendees would leave knowing a bit more about the beneficial contribution of the Muslim community to our common life. Second, we hoped that the attendees would be inspired by such knowledge and would sign up for future house meetings focusing on anti-Muslim bigotry. We had sign-up sheets and surveys to measure our success. This event took place the day after the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled on marriage equality. The main panel, featuring a rabbi, an imam, and an African-American minister, addressed the challenges and opportunities of building relationships across religious divides. Going off script, the rabbi commented positively on the court's ruling. He then turned to the imam and said that religious congregations have to be more welcoming to their gay and lesbian neighbors. This put the imam in such a place where he felt obligated to, on the one hand, recognize, yet again, his minority status in relation to the larger community. And on the other hand, he felt obligated to express an experience of loss in regard to what his community holds sacred. He commented that while he recognized the legitimacy of the court's rule, as a leader of a faith community, he had to disagree with the rabbi's statement. For him and his community, as an imam, it was a sad day. This story exemplifies the untidy and contested status of sacred value in democratic politics. I want to postulate, not unduly, I think, that both the rabbi and the imam hold marriage as a sacred value. If this is the case, how should interfaith community organizers approach such conflicts of sacred value? Traditionally, and unfortunately, organizers have marginalized sacred values in their practice because they fear sacred values will splinter group solidarity. But that need not be the case. Conflicts of sacred value do not spell doom for our efforts to organize across differences of what we hold most dear. In my short time today, I want to accomplish two things. First, to illustrate the role of sacred values in two specific organizing practices, the relational meeting and the listening campaign, in order to demonstrate that these practices can be seen as religious practices. The relational meeting and the listening campaign are the bread and butter of broad-based organizing. A relational meeting is a public, value-directed conversation between two people on what they care most about in their community and what they are willing to do to fight and protect those values, goods, and people. A listening campaign is a series of relational meetings carried out within a single institutional organization with the aim of identifying the institution's core values and issues. The first point leads to the second, which can be put like so. Interfaith studies needs an account of the political role of sacred values. As Melissa Snar has recently written, there are perhaps three dominant strands of approaching interfaith engagement. The first is interfaith dialogue that often focuses on ideas, values, but often without the hard challenges of enacting those values in public and political action. Second, interfaith service often brings folk together for care and charity, but with little attention to structural change and power work. And third, in contrast, interfaith organizing, which focuses on issues, but can become so dominant, the issue focus can become so dominant that sacred value work is seen as too time and labor intensive, perhaps even irrelevant, except as initial motivation. Even then, Melissa Snar continues, sacred value work is often seen as primarily the purviews of sending institutions into the coalition. Now, my own account of the political role of sacred value brings insight from post-Hegelian social theory into conversation with political and theological insights. Hegel's grand and expansive view of philosophy and history, social and historical, social and normative nature of reasoning benefits this analysis. As I elaborate a political role of sacred values, I ground it in an account of social practical reasoning. Social practical reasoning requires practices of mutual recognition and determinate negation. Indeed, spirit emerges as absolute spirit in Hegel's sense under conditions of reciprocal recognition. Tragic conflicts of value in social practical reasoning are cases of misrecognition. Organizing practices like the relational meeting and the listening campaign, when done well, place individuality and reciprocal recognition at the core. They can be seen as religious practices that place evaluative attitudes, like sacred value, in the broader inferential scene of social practical reasoning. Reciprocal recognition is a potential outcome of a one-on-one, the relational meeting. By figuring sacred values, mutual recognition, and the ethical life of spirit in the relational meeting, we gain epistemic, practical, and spiritual insights into the interfaith practice itself. We see just what is at stake in this organizing practice for its many religious participants. But first, let me say a word about interfaith broad-based organizing. Over the last 20 years, broad-based community organizing has made a name for itself. With the election of Barack Obama and the telling of his organizing story in Dreams from My Father, the U.S. American public began to turn again to the life and work of that radical Saul Alinsky, who founded the Industrial Areas Foundation in Chicago's Back of the Yards neighborhood in 1940. For years, it seemed that no one was interested in writing about organizing except Alinsky and his proteges. Nowadays, things have changed. An interdisciplinary field has emerged that spans religious studies, theology, sociology, and politics. The practice of organizing is grounded in social practical reasoning. Practical reasoning as a social practice means that the values, principles, and norms that guide the practice are shared and are based in shared assumptions, patterns of behavior, and goods internal and external to the practice itself. Often, social practices become part of the broader culture institutions, which can work to cultivate goods internal to a practice, thereby fostering and cultivating virtues that serve to realize the internal goods. Here, social structures are collections of practices. Habit and intentionality can and do go together in this account, where social practical reasoning takes place in time and makes possible the critique of our practices based on normative analysis of that very practice. Our social practices, the institutions that hold them, and the very practice of social practical reasoning are not naturally immune from criticism. A Christian practice may be exploitive, racist, misogynistic, or dominating. And so we can critique such a practice on its own Christian terms and norms of justice and love. Now, evaluative attitudes like sacred value are part of the social endeavor of broad-based organizing. Individuals practice organizing differently in different settings, and so the action itself is characterized by style and urgency. To try and exclude sacred values from the practice of organizing asks participants to lop off a critical part of their sense of self, thereby maiming narrative unity that is often sought for in religious and political lives. Because sacred values are a kind of evaluative attitude, they are subjected to the social construction process undergone by all social kinds that are subjected to our judgments in social practical reasoning. Those who are concerned about questions of religion and politics at the center of broad-based organizing need to pay attention to the role of such valuations in our practice of organizing and how people understand such practices in the broader narrative of their religious tradition. Interfaith coalitions like broad-based organizing affiliates need not limit their organizing domain to consensus issues, which in fact just shrinks the political imagination of the affiliate. Instead, sacred values need to be engaged in lived religious practices that, yes, have the potential to stir up intense conflict within the affiliate, but such tension can be a generative of deeper relationships that provide insights into how individuals live out their religious traditions through their organizing practice. Broad-based organizing is about the relationships and values of working people for greater democratic power in their communities. When organizing forgets its value and relational basis, it becomes twisted into a practice of building economic and political power for power's sake. But each action in the practice of broad-based organizing is geared toward developing stronger leaders for stronger institutions to ensure more powerful affiliates. When it forgets its focus on power building, it becomes sentimental. The best organizers that I've known and witnessed ground their power building in their own and their fellow leaders' sacred values. It is the relational meeting, and specifically when organizers seek to agitate others, where a tension between values and power building can erupt, and where the practice can be melded to the ends of domination over others. As a human practice, the relational meeting and agitation are often twisted awry to evil ends. Organizers end up bullying, shaming, berating, and breaking down leaders in a way that deforms the practice of organizing and the Christian sacred value of the human individual. Here, the work of organizing is hobbled by its affinities to form of anti-democratic mastery predominant in the U.S. heteropatriarchal racial capitalist society. Figures of the boss, bully, and strongman come to dominate the organizing imagination. The relational meeting needs to be grounded in sacred values, or else the practice becomes deformed and myopic. Couched in a democratic culture and grounded in sacred values, the practice of the relational meeting can be seen as a religious practice wherein individuals narrate their own experience of suffering and loss, together with others as they organize for greater democratic power. So consider the listening campaign. From September to December of 2018, I led a single congregation through a listening campaign. In May of 2019, during the election season, the congregation invited the candidate from Metropolitan Council to Sunday worship and to a forum held after, where several leaders reported on the issues and values identified during the listening campaign. The practice of the listening campaign is more than a series of relational meetings within the congregation. Importantly, it also includes the congregation taking action on issues and values in a way that enacts those values. When I speak about the listening campaign, I am referring to this entire process of intentional listening, discernment, and action, whereby the congregation acts publicly in a way that announces their public identity to its political representatives. The meeting with the Metropolitan Council member was a small action, but it made clear to the council member what the congregation cares about, and also that this congregation was paying attention to his work as their representative. However small, it was a statement of public witness by the congregation and demonstrates how the listening campaign itself is a religious practice, grounded in what values the congregation holds most dear. But to make this case, I want to start at the beginning with the training of leaders and how to hold a relational meeting. In late August of 2018, I gathered 15 members of a congregation together for a relational meeting training with a fellow organizer. Let's call him Tim. Because institutional membership is constantly under pressure and undergoing change, the relational meeting is a crucial part of any single institution's organizing process. Families grow and responsibilities shift, jobs change, and people move to follow them. Once strong leaders burn out. In the cycle of organizing, disorganizing, and reorganizing, the relational meeting is a crucial tool to help institutions identify new leaders, core values, and concerns of their membership, while reweaving the relational fabric of the institution. After a dinner of pizza and salad in the fellowship hall, I started the training by exploring the scriptural roots of the relational meeting. Although I was not attempting an exegesis, much of what I presented to the group was intellectual and heady. Imagine that. The group seemed uninspired. Tim suggested that we mock out a relational meeting where I would illustrate the role of the leader initiating the one-on-one. I began by asking Tim about his experiences that propelled him to organizing. He shared a story of a Black neighbor who organized her own neighborhood and won infrastructure improvements. She was so energized by this that she started organizing a white community to do the same. He shared stories of neighborhoods coming together and building power. This went on for several minutes before I cut him off. Tim, all of this is interesting and inspiring, but you aren't in it. Where are you in these stories? The question made Tim pause, and he never really responded. We ended that section of the training, and the night went on. Following my gut and intuition, I intentionally interrupted Tim when he began telling me stories about other people. I was looking for Tim's self-interest, not stories about the self-interest of others. I interrupted Tim and asked him a short, snappy question because I wanted to agitate him. I wanted to wake him up. I found Tim's stories to be the helping experiences that are often shared in liberal social justice circles. But such stories lack self-interest and failed to explain the value that guide Tim's work. I was curious to hear Tim reflect on his own experience, so I probed deeper. There is more going on here than curiosity and probing, however. The relational meeting challenges people to give an account of their lives, to explore their self-interest, and to make meaning out of experiences of personal suffering, loss, love, regret, grief, and transform them into publicly actionable issues. The relational meeting provides a chance for someone to see their life in a different way, to consider their position in the all too often unacknowledged relationships of power that make up our society. Such questions require reflection on any number of social identities. I was curious to hear Tim reflect on the significance of his work to his larger story as a father, as a Christian, as a middle-aged white man living in a mid-sized city in the South. Such questions require vulnerability from Tim and require me to tend to him, to attend to his feelings and emotions, to listen, at times intuitively, to his story. Such vulnerability is a unique space to engage in the mutual and co-constructive work of building democratic relationships of solidarity. The relational meeting is an embodied practice. There are seldom moments in our daily life when we sit face to face with someone in public and tell our story. Being asked questions that unearth our sacred values stirs up physical responses in us. Such questions can make us uncomfortable, and our body language shows our experience of vulnerability in public. We feel differently in these conversations because the values and issues we are talking about matter to us in a qualitative, experiential sense. Such probing questions aren't scripted, but drawn from attending to one's story, driven more by intuition and a sense of the habitus and a potential to revise it. Though the relational meeting is a conversation, it involves a form of listening that is attentive to people's suffering, to their vulnerability. And for Christians, it inevitably involves the question of what God has to say about such suffering and pain. The one-on-one involves attending to how an individual's story fits into a larger religious tradition and narrative. In reflecting on my own story, I can invite others to do the same. In the one-on-one, I am listening for the values behind the issues. I am actively engaging the story being crafted before me, and I seek to honor that story and other stories to which it is connected. I pay attention to body language and the physical presence of the individual responding to my questions. The practice of the relational meeting asks people to embody and feel formative experiences they are sharing again. Story work is hard work. As I ask questions, I am reflexively aware of my own self, monitoring how the story is impacting me and how this mutual story work contributes to the relational work of building a democratic culture. Such narrative work is political and religious because it asks people to critically and collectively reflect on experiences of power in their lives, what they are willing to do to protect those things and people that they hold most dear from arbitrary exercises of power, and what the religious tradition might have to say about such political relationships. Such narrative work is guided by social practical reasoning, and insofar as it engages in the social practice of a tradition's right expression of care and concern, engages in revision of traditions within certain limits. Such narrative work is a part of what it means to say that religious identities are socially constructed. Being a member of a tradition is to improvise within particular limits, to tell familiar stories anew. Now, in social practical reasoning, our capacity of giving reasons turns on making inferential commitments when making judgments of and about objects in the world that stand in certain inferential relations. This is just what self-conscious rationality consists in. The ability to make materially sound inferential commitments in our judgments entails a gentle responsibility and authority for other commitments about and of a world of objects and subjects that we take to be a certain way. Such reasoning is normatively constrained so that we cannot, at the expense of being deemed irrational, take on materially incompatible commitments. Material incompatibility refers to the ongoing inferential process and structure of social practical reasoning. It is another way of talking about what Hegel referred to as determinate negation. It helps explain how concept use brings along inferential relationships that include or exclude other concepts. In speaking of the city of Nashville, my reasoning about Nashville is constrained by the fact that it is southwest of New York City. Everything else I say about Nashville should agree with that fact, or I need to correct a commitment or belief. Practical reasoning is mastering normative use of concepts and materially sound inferential commitments we are attributed and attribute to others by this practice. This understanding of concept use as entailing inferential commitments and responsibility means that agents can be held accountable for concept use and the norms that guide discursive reasoning about the world. This is a social pragmatic approach to discursive reasoning, where meaning is defined through an ongoing inferential process and grounded in inferential structure of relationships with others and the broader world. Now, material incompatibility sits at the heart of Hegel's understanding of negation and mediation. It is an objective and subjective. Spirit moves by negation. This approach to the practice of reasoning stands in contrast with the traditional understanding of agents being directed by a superior to whom they are obedient, where sources or standards of normative authority are external to the community of individual reasoners. Hegel teaches us that discursive reasoning depends on reciprocal recognition from other subjects and is expressed in history. Reasoning is diachronic and previous concept use, and so previous meanings constrain our own use. His is a historical, social, and dynamic perspective. Hegel shows the openness of rationality. By grounding it in the ethical life of a community, practical reasoning is just as dependent upon an agent's taking up materially sound inferential commitments as it is on others attributing such inferential commitments to us. Practical reasoning is a social practice that is grounded in the ethical life of a community, where normativity, responsibility, and authority all find their standards in the community's social practice of reasoning. So recall the rabbi and the imam story. These points help review that the rabbi and imam are more than their individual selves as reasoners. But instead, excuse me, I'm going to move these slides here. Okay, this is where I want to be here. I just want to make sure we don't miss this. So recall the rabbi and the imam story. These points help reveal that the rabbi and imam are more than their individual selves as reasoners, but instead are participants in communities of reasoning to which they are held accountable and for which they are responsible. For Hegel, the inferential social practice of practical reasoning doesn't get off the ground without recognition and determinate negation. Practices of recognition are crucial to social practical reasoning. Spirit moves through practices of recognition and determinate negation. But spirit is a notoriously elusive term, and how an interpreter reads spirit in Hegel tips readers off to larger interpretive stances. But for my purposes, spirit in Hegel is ethical, social pragmatic, idealist, political, and theological. Spirit refers to the normative structure of reciprocal relations and the individual and collective inferential practice of reasoning. Reciprocal recognition gets Hegel's conception of individual and collective identity off the ground, but mutual recognition is a social practice. The human practice of determining conceptual content is a social historical one in which conceptual content is worked out through relationships of authority and accountability. Unless we count as fellow practitioners and mutually recognize others to count as such, the ethical shapes of spirit are incomplete. Spirit develops through mutual recognition and determinate negation. When spirit's development is frustrated or incomplete, as imagined in Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, by the figures of the lord and the bondsman, or in the wicked and judging consciousness before their reconciling mutual recognition, our practice of determining conceptual content itself goes off the tracks. And at least in Hegel's story, we remain in a lower shape of spirit. For Hegel, recognition is both an epistemic and a practical matter. Recognition involves treating something as a locus of authority and accountability, as a mediating self-conscious subject of intersubjective meaning, not as a mere object. Evaluative attitudes like sacred values are a crucial part of the story of recognition because values or normative attitudes we take up and enact and others recognize or do not. This is in part what makes the conflict with the rabbi and the imam so relatable. The case puts forward the question of how and under what conditions certain members of our political groups matter in the relevant sense as authoritative bearers of values that are mutually recognized in the group. Deformed recognition of the imam is misrecognition of the imam himself as a bearer of such values. Reciprocal recognition is crucial for individual and social formation. When the rabbi says to the imam, our religious leaders need to do a better job of welcoming our gay and lesbian neighbors, and the imam responds to the rabbi by saying, for me and my community, it was a sad day, they are engaging in their own social practical reasoning of sacred value. The imam is recognizing certain evaluative attitudes as having authority over his own life and practices. He is claiming that such precedents also hold authority over the community he recognizes and which recognizes him. But he is also recognizing that other communities value things differently. Social practical reasoning takes place in relationships of power, and my account of the political role of sacred value presumes radically democratic political conditions. By figuring the political significance of sacred value first requires that we understand the role of sacred value in our political discourse, as it plays out, for example, in quotidian scenes like the imam and rabbi exchange. Spirit is driven by mutual recognition and determinate negation. Social practices of mutual recognition and determinate negation, or material incompatibility, actualize and concretize spirit. Ethical life depends upon social practices of recognition. Seeing practices of reciprocal recognition as constitutive of spirit's emergence through determinate negation stays off any putative claims of spirit as a transcendental unity that swallows up individuality. Spirit needs to be actual in the life of people for it to continue its development. Individuality is only a social ethical possibility. One of the points of the relational meeting, and the listening campaign for that matter, is to weave a relational fabric out of which political and economic power can be built. Relational meetings mean to break people out of their isolation and connect people together to take public action that is powerful. By telling our stories, we move private pain into the sphere of public action. We realize that our stories are not ours alone, but are shared, and a collective emerges out of which action can be taken. The listening campaign seeks to reweave the relationships within and beyond our institutions of broad-based organizing coalitions in order to win political and economic freedoms. Wins are gained in part by building relational power. In philosophical terms, relationships of reciprocal recognition build relational power. They are non-dominating, built on humility without humiliation, as Molly Farnath has put it. But such storytelling requires determinate negation, individuality, not individualism. As we engage in the process of telling our stories, of determining our identity as distinct from others, not as mere difference, but actual difference, grounded in determinate negation, we create the ethical conditions for social freedom. Reciprocal recognition requires individuals to trust their own and others' authority as bearers of ethical and epistemic standards, and who hold themselves accountable to the relevant communities of practice that constitute the relational fabric, making such inferential practices possible. Ethical life is achieved when a community fosters ongoing social practices of mutual recognition that allow absolute spirit to emerge. This step of recognition is spirit's recognition that it is an I that is a we, and a we that is an I. Freedom here is social and intersubjective from the beginning. The sort of ethical community that fosters such freedom does not absorb or reduce individuals to some homogeneity, but rather presupposes, requires, and accepts individuals in their differences. Unity is established in and through difference. Recognition that is established through the relational meeting forms an ethical community that can foster relationships of liberation and love that is grounded in individuality, in the worth of one's story, experience, and values, which is only possible because individuals come from communities that form and shape them. The process of recognition itself is built into social practical reasoning because such a community mediates our selfhood and provides us with a language to tell our stories in the first place. As we tell these stories, we depend upon inferential practices of reasoning insofar as we recognize others as bearers of the community out of and through which we identify ourselves. The relationships of love and liberation that are established through the practices of mutual recognition are mediated through relations of inference and inferential practices of social practical reasoning. Conflicts of incommensurability, like the one between the rabbi and imam, are not isolated incidents, but such conceptual conflicts between diverging interpretations of the meaning of marriage, say, are tangled with a whole host of inferential relations and processes. Incommensurability is a fact about our world. Humans are lovers who cherish different goods differently. Some of these goods they hold sacred, but these sacred values are connected to a web of other values and goods and experiences that help us figure their proper role in our political life. An age-old organizing adage is relevant here. When in doubt, do a one-on-one. We need to understand the accompanying emotions and inferences concomitant with sacred values. The rabbi and imam example puts deformed recognition on display. To repair that relationship, to organize with sacred value, a relational meeting could be held between the rabbi and imam to build deeper relationships between leaders who hold differences to hold the difference that exists. This is a very Hegelian point. Determinate difference is a relationship, a very deep one that should not be ignored. The more we ignore such conflicts, the more they will bubble up in unfriendly places. We did not anticipate the rabbi's statement, but organizing takes place in time, by which I mean that the deformed recognition that occurred here will reverberate through their relationship and even impact others. The relational ripple effects of the deformed recognition need to be dealt with. Organizers should not ignore the source of incommensurability. To repair the relationship and reestablish recognition, organizers need to organize with sacred values. As I've tried to show, the relational meeting opens the possibility of recognition in deep difference. BBCO itself, broad-based organizing, has the tools that can hold such tension and determinate difference. Conflicts of sacred value are relationships. More than this, offering recognition and determinate difference is key to building relational power, which is necessary for diverse religious constituencies to achieve political and economic wins. We are better off if we understand the broader social practical picture of these conflicts and organize with them. So here's the conclusion. The one-on-one creates space not only for expansions of theological imagination, but also political imagination, in that it authorizes expressions often viewed as inappropriate by broader society. Centering sacred values in the practice of organizing expands our political theological imaginations. Religious practices exist in power relationships, and the normative significance we ascribe to those relationships depends on our own narrations of our experiences in relationship to the broader tradition. BBCO limits its theopolitical resources by excluding sacred values from its organizing process. By drilling deeper into the evaluative and normative nature of social practical reasoning, we get a sense of how religion and politics are deeply interwoven. Values and relationships sit at the heart of broad-based organizing. What was previously seen as the limit of a group's solidarity and possibility in pluralist society, pluralist politics, may turn out to be an expanding horizon. The point for us is to create religiously pluralistic settings that are not assimilationist to Christian liturgical styles or dominated by a Christian theological framework. What we end up with may be an organizing setting that contains a mosaic of values and commitments, and that can effectively foster solidarity in a religiously diverse constituency. Because radically democratic counterpublics are discursive, and because practical reasoning is inferentially governed by normative commitments of responsibility and accountability, these values do not stay in silos, but inform one another. I am arguing for deeper entanglement between different religious values and organizing practices in a particular kind of organizing setting. Conflicts of sacred value are a part of our everyday life, and politics is characterized by loss. But a conflict of sacred values is not rightly conceived as a war between locked, incommensurable positions. We are familiar with an emotional range of expressions to handle such conflicts, and it is part of social practical reasoning that we have a rationally grounded range of emotional expressions. This very practice inferentially commits us to being held accountable and responsible for our judgments. We enact these evaluative attitudes in practices in everyday life. Such religious practices brings us into relationship with others who disagree with us, but disagreement, even a distinctly tension-ridden and agitational moments of disagreement, is a relationship that allows people to bring their whole self into the organizing space. When deep disagreement does occur regarding matters of sacred value, building value-based relationships and instilling an understanding within the constituency that these are matters of sacred value and therefore they play a crucial role in the organizing process, even if leading to different stances, can help build relationships of trust and accountability. Disagreement cannot and should not always be avoided, especially regarding matters that people hold most dear. In fact, sacred values can help deepen solidarity, even amidst disagreement. The pragmatic process of political action will then take leave from that value and relational basis. Action is directed toward issues, but the range of actionable issues is now broader. Organizers need to pay attention to how different religious narratives understand different values that are basic to the stories that guide this work. This is work that involves difficult conversation. Organizers need to ask, how is it that you have come to understand these terms as your terms only? We need to create spaces that are emotionally, spiritually, and politically conducive to multiple values, each held as sacred in our organizing circles. We need to encourage the political reflection that affirms that some practices express and enact the lived religious aspect of organizing. Such creation of settings and enactments of practices need to be done in a way that centers traditionally marginalized voices and religions. Simply starting a public action with different faith leaders offering prayers in their own religious language is not enough. that merely places such traditions in their own neat silos without looking at the stances taken between the various practitioners in a radically democratic public. We need to build relationships that ask leaders to do the necessary narrative work and self-reflection that challenges them to consider their values that ground this work, how such values are in relationship with other sacred values, and how organizing enacts such values in lived religious practices. A politics that seeks to avoid varied human expressions of sacred value turns out to be emotionally shallow and brittle. It cannot hold our whole narratives that seek to rationally express our relationship to the values we hold sacred. We need a political theology of organizing that gives us our griefs and joys of sacred value. Organizers need to develop settings that allow for such expressions and enactments of sacred value. We need to explore the theological and political value of recognizing some organizing practices as religious practices. Allowing leaders to explore the discomfort of being agitated in relationship with others who hold different sacred values will deepen the relational bonds within the constituency, even if this means being uncomfortable. Such work is not only theologically and politically generative, it also allows our leaders to be honest and whole persons in the work of organizing. When constituencies create settings that hold tension in relationship across divides of sacred value, deep moral and political formation can take place. In those spaces of tension and agitation, deeper self-reflection can occur, leading to growth of self-interest in the constituency. Such moral and political growth takes place amidst broader political conditions that center heteropatriarchal racial capitalism. The social norms and ideals that we trade in social practical reasoning are given to us as much as we make them our own. This does not mean that revision of values and norms is not possible, but only that such revision is hard-won, driven by radically democratic processes that start with experiences of the marginalized and takes place within certain limits. To hear the stories of another, to honor and respect them requires creating emotional and spiritual space within our own practice to reflect on how such listening and narrating builds relationships that enact sacred values amidst vast differences. Such patient and slow work, however, builds relational power that is self-directing and not at the whim of electoral campaigns, which never seem to end. Hearing how fellow leaders find theological and political meaning in organizing creates space for agitation and tension in relationship. Relational meetings have the power of literally moving leaders from one space to another, from one issue to another. It is politically and theologically agitating in a way that awakens us from our slumber of politics, as usual. For too long, BBCO has illustrated its religious diversity by opening public actions with various religious leaders offering prayers. This is exactly what I do not want to encourage. I'm not against such public actions of prayer. They are fine and good insofar as they go. What I am calling for instead is a deeper honesty about the role of theology and religious diversity within the practice of organizing itself. And I want to help leaders articulate and enact that in all aspects of their organizing in a way that goes beyond recognition politics and such representationalist maneuvers. Lead with the values and relationships in a way that troubles neat, isolated distinctions of roles between religion or clergy and politics, elected officials. Have leaders strategically confront politicians on moral and theological grounds without sacrificing attention to power politics. Center the organizing strategy around the relational meaning of values rather than the issue campaign, which only leads to electoralitis and voter fatigue. Hold public leaders accountable for their centering of white Christianity on theological and political grounds. Refuse to relegate religion and religious diversity to the opening 3-minute prayer, and pay attention to how sacred values move your leaders in their religious and political lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for that very enriching and thought-provoking presentation, and I would say ambitious as well in certain ways, and rightfully so, and I think necessary. One thing I always talk about in public spaces with folks is that, you know, when it comes to intro to studies and dialogue, think about one's own personal relationships. Those who we are closest with are oftentimes the one that we have sometimes the most tension with. And so to really develop substantive relationships, we have to be able to live in that space. the space to exist where there is tension is important, right? How do you think it can potentially, if there are two groups that want to do something that is social justice oriented and find themselves in this sacred value tension, how do you propose that two individuals or the group work through that so as to get to what the telos is of that relationship, which is social justice oriented? Is there a danger in leaning into the differences that can arrest the overarching goal to get to that social justice, and that the groups have come together in the first place to get to?
Yeah, Said, I think this is such a good question. And I think an equal temptation of this. I think one, I don't want people to walk away thinking I'm only wanting us to only talk about our differences, right?
Right.
Like there are relationships all multifaceted and complex. And so I think to start, there are 2 points here to think about. The first is, you know, if it's between two individuals, I think it is just building a relationship, just doing a one-on-one, really listening to the stories and finding the places of disagreement and also resonance. I mean, there are similar, even the fact that if both of you are part of a group because you feel that something you hold most dear is threatened or violated, that in itself, even if those lead to different actions, is a similarity, right? If you think about, oh, we equally hold these things to be most dear to us, we need to act around that. And so then you reflect about, even if things lead to diverging actions, there's a similarity there. But also just like getting to know people, asking questions about whether you have kids or what your context is like. You're in the same city, like maybe you know similar people, like just thinking about that broadly. And the second point is that if you have an organization of organizations where there are many different if it's a constituency of other different religious institutions, say, religious bodies, it is a question of the broader narrative of the group itself. What is the identity of the group, right? Why are we here? We being the many different group institutions. So you have to do this narrative work and relationship building at the individual and at the group level. I mean, groups naturally do this, right? You join a group because of certain reasons, and then there is a sort of groups then define themselves either more or less starkly to others. So we all maybe know some groups that are just like, well, anybody can join. And for others, there are memberships that's much more stringent. That's identity work that's going on there. So the group itself will have to discern and collectively explore what it means to be a part of the group, what the group's mission and work actually is. And the pragmatic process of political action may put particular issues as a higher priority than others. That's just kind of how it is that groups engage in democracy. But things are anti-democratic insofar as a group consistently asks the same members to sacrifice things, right? Then it's not democratic anymore. Then it's like, okay, well, yeah, you need to exit, right? This is not a group for you. They're not representing you. They're not recognizing you, right? That's the misrecognition there. You don't count to them.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So, Aaron, thank you again for this really enriching presentation. I really do hope that people appreciate your work for what it is and how to think about interreligious dialogue and interreligious studies, in a much more active way. And I think that's where it needs to go. I mean, yes, thinking about interreligious, increasing our interreligious knowledge in the classroom is important, but how does that look like in real life with real people? And I think that's where your work is incredibly helpful and incredibly enriching. And and I hope that more people can appreciate for that, and some of the instruction that you provide on how to make interreligious studies and dialogue more substantive. So thank you so much for
Thank
this
you.
wonderful presentation and your time.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.